Okay, welcome everybody. How's the mic? Can everybody hear me at the back? Good? Okay. So my name is Rico Francis, and I'm here to talk about here to do the Freud lecture. Still, you can't hear? How's that? Better? Okay. The only problem is I can't see my text now. So, ever used the word subconscious? Welcome to Freud's world. Ever lost your keys and cannot find them? And then a few hours later, they show up in exactly the place that you were looking for them, and you just cannot work out how you could have missed them the first time around. Welcome to psychoanalysis. Let me tell you a little story. I had a friend when I was at university who was really sharp and smart, always did very well, and we often studied for exams together. Then one day, for one exam, she didn't show up. After the exam was over, I spoke to her and asked her what had happened. She was in a terrible state. She just did not understand how it could have happened, but she had set the alarm clock, and she realized afterwards it was too late, that she had set it for the wrong time, PM instead of AM. This was completely atypical of her. She was usually extremely responsible, fastidious, careful. How could this have happened? Welcome to psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud, I've got two pictures over here, when he's a young man and just before he dies. Sigmund Freud was born in the Czech Republic in 1856. He dies in London in 1938 at the age of 82. However, at a young age, he moves to Vienna and lives and works there all his life, until he leaves Vienna for London, fleeing the Nazis in 1938, just a few months before his death. So he really is a product of Vienna, which is a real cultural hub at that time. He's trained as a medical doctor, specializing in neurology, but he very soon becomes interested in patients with psychological disturbances, and he spends the rest of his life working in that area. He developed the technique called psychoanalysis that we will be discussing today. So the word psychoanalysis comes from psyche, which is the Greek word for mind, or it really is mind more than brain. It's the same word from which we get psychology, right? And then analysis, as in the understanding of the breaking down into component parts, so as better to understand what's happening. Psychoanalysis is the attempt at understanding the human mind. Let me show you a picture. Have a look at this picture over here. You can see that it is a massive giant rock. Oops. Massive giant rock. And on top of the rock, there is a castle made out of the same substance as the rock, right? This is the very epitome of, a mighty castle standing on a mighty rock. It looks absolutely impregnable. Nothing could happen. Nothing could be more solid. Except if I tell you that this is actually just half of the painting. The other half, is this. And so this is the epitome of castles in the air, right? So on the one hand, you believe completely in the strength and fortress-like quality of everything that's happening here, and yet somehow it's all become unstable. It's all floating, it's up in the air. Everything that you thought was absolutely solid has kind of melted away into this strange other world of instability. This is a painting by René Magritte, by the way, a Belgian surrealist. It's called The Castle of the Pyrenees from 1958. Now, I'm using this as an analogy for what psychoanalysis is about, right? Let me sum up what I think is Freud's most important contribution to contemporary thought. You think you're in control, but you're not. But it's not that you're not in control because somebody else is in control. That sometimes happens too, it's true, but that's not what I'm talking about. You think you're in control of yourself, but you're not, because another part of you, one that you are not aware of, is instead in control of who you are. There's a hidden part of you that's responsible for pretty much all that you do and all that you think. And this is what Freud calls the unconscious. So the unconscious, which is abbreviated generally to UCS, by the way, the unconscious, most of what we do and think is actually the unconscious doing its thing. Freud divides up the mind into two major parts, the conscious and the unconscious. By the way, Freud never uses the word subconscious. That's kind of a pop psychology aspect. And if you want to sound like a real intellectual, when next time somebody says subconscious, say, I think you mean the unconscious, right? So the consciousness, or the conscious, is the you who you think you are. It's the you that is available to your awareness of yourself. You think about yourself, your character, personality, your likes, dislikes, experiences, your ethics and morality. All of that is your consciousness. Now, attached to the conscious is a system that Freud calls the pre-conscious. It's like the reservoir from which consciousness draws, on which consciousness draws for the most part. The things that you have forgotten, but that you can remember with a little effort and memory jogging, belong to the pre-conscious. So there's some things you've forgotten, but you think about them, somebody reminds you, and it's like, oh, yeah, I remember that, right? That's the stuff that's in your pre-conscious. The unconscious, however, is radically different to the conscious and pre-conscious. It consists of things you don't even know that you think. And what's more, it's blocked to your own conscious thinking. You can't get to it just by thinking, by remembering. It's barred or hidden. So the difference between the pre-conscious and the unconscious, right? Pre-conscious, you can get there, you can think your way there. But the unconscious, you can't get there by yourself. You can't think your way to it. So how does the unconscious happen? Where does it come from? We weren't born with it. Rather, it comes into being as we develop as children. So in the first place, this is a story about growing up, and thus it starts with infancy. I want you to stop and think for a moment about what happens to kids as they get older, and how we as adults deal with them. On the one hand, when kids are very young, they're uncoordinated and they know nothing, right? And we're always saying to them, do this, do that, but we're also saying, don't do that, right? Do this, don't do that, to teach them, to protect them. But think about this in another way. One of the things we're doing as we say, do this, don't do that, is we're teaching them about becoming social human beings. We're teaching them to follow more and more the rules of society, of what we can and cannot do. And if you think about it, most of the time you pass with the very young is spent not saying to them, do that, it's rather more saying to them, don't do that. Right? Kids seem to want to do lots of things that we as adults think they shouldn't be doing. But if you follow this through a little bit more about this phenomenon of having to say no to kids all the time, we arrive at the strange proposition. In order to become a functioning human being, a social being, like the people we live amongst and see around us, we only get to be that by learning not to do. There are tons of things we do as kids that are entirely unacceptable, and we have to learn not to do them. So it's not just a question of learning to do things, but much more a question of learning not to do things. But now here's the problem. We have these desires that are just not permissible in society. What do you do then? You try to forget them. But think how long it takes to get kids to change, how often you have to say no. Forgetting of desires, it turns out, is very difficult. In fact, says Freud, we never forget. We never stop in our desires. They never go away. They just persist. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Yeah. Sorry, thanks. So, what do you do as a subject? What do you do when faced with what you desire so strongly, which is also the thing that you are prohibited from indulging? Well, says Freud, because these things are forbidden, but equally because they don't go away, because you can't get rid of them, you suppress them. They're pushed underground, and you try your best not to be aware of them. In fact, you pretend to yourself, although let's be technical here, your consciousness, because that's the part that you're aware of, your conscious pretends to itself that those things don't exist. The technical term for this is repression. We repress these forbidden, prohibited desires. This means that they effectively become split off from our conscious minds. And that thing that consciousness excludes from itself, rejects from itself, and tries to forget is the unconscious. It's unconscious precisely because it's forbidden from entering consciousness. I can't emphasize enough how these things are radically separated from each other. Thus, the unconscious, containing all those desires, splits off and becomes its own entity, with its own rules and modes of functioning. And those desires stay in there, bubbling away. They continue to affect us. They infiltrate our lives, push us in all sorts of strange directions, make us do all sorts of strange things that our consciousness would never dream of, like the examples just given above. Think of it as a suitcase into which you put all the things that are forbidden to you, all the thoughts, wishes, desires that you carry around with you, except that you don't know you're carrying it. So effectively, that means you are seeing only that part, right? That's the part that you're seeing, that you're conscious of. That's the part that's the unconscious. Now, I'm going to talk for a moment about subjectivity. We mentioned this already in relation to consciousness. It concerns you as a subject. You think of yourself, you have an idea of who you are or what makes you you. You know who you are because you think of yourself. You're the subject of your own consciousness. But now here's the strange part. As far as you're concerned, when you think about yourself, you are one person. But from now on, with the unconscious, the subject is not one, but two. There is one you, who is the conscious, and another you who is the unconscious. Right? Your conscious is thinking about you in one way, and your unconscious is thinking about you in another. For example, you're walking along the street, and you see something lying on the sidewalk. The kid in your unconscious says, as all kids do, something in front of me on the floor, yum, let me put it in my mouth. Your conscious, the adult in you, is saying, yuck, that's disgusting. You're the subject of two desires, and you don't know it, or feel it, in fact, because you don't know it or feel it because you don't feel it in your conscious because that second desire is unconscious. You are, on a very minor level in this example, a conflicted subject, torn between two desires, between two subject positions. Now you can see why these childish desires have to be repressed, right? No socialized, functioning adult in their right mind could possibly admit to themselves that they have a desire such as this. In fact, says psychoanalysis, your disgust is one of the mechanisms to help you keep your repressed desires at a distance, to disavow that desire. And so now we come back to, or actually let me just show you the next diagram. Okay, so this is a diagram of the map that I've just been talking about here. I'm going to step across here. I think you can. Oh, actually, there's the microphone. Okay. So here is in schematic diagram form what I've just been talking about. So this top, everything above this line over here is the conscious, and part of the conscious is the pre-conscious, right? And so it consists of, so your consciousness of thoughts and processes, that's the stuff you're aware of. Over here are memories and stored knowledge that you're not necessarily aware of all the time, but can come back to you. But then over here you have the unconscious, and everything in the unconscious over here, you can see this rigid black line over here, that's to show this real bar between these two areas over here. This is a whole series of other thoughts. In this particular diagram, there are things like violent motives, fears, unacceptable sexual desires, irrational wishes. I'll talk about that more just in a moment. But the primary idea is this two-part split between the consciousness and the unconscious. And you can think also about this in relation to those first examples that I just gave, that I gave at the beginning, talking about why did my friend miss her exam? Why can you not find those keys that you're looking for? It's got something to do, and we'll see more about that in a second. It's got something to do with what's happening in the unconscious. And of course, that's the point. You don't know. You look for your keys, you can't find them. There's nothing in your consciousness about that, but something is happening in your unconscious that's making you do this. Now, some broad repercussions of all of this. I want to come back to the main theme of your reading for today, which is Freud's work, Civilization and its Discontents. Civilization, that's the thing we think of as being the greatest achievement of humanity, right? Civilization relates to our social being, to our construction of society, our living together. Our living together in community. Before Freud, people generally just asked, how can we make society better? People thought we could get better at doing it. There was nothing really standing in the way of constructing a better society. And that even more than that, the better the society, the happier we will be as humans. But Freud says, no, that's not how it works. He says our human nature, because of our unconscious, is fundamentally opposed to civilization. Freud is the first person to look at society and say that it's something that doesn't really suit us as humans, strangely enough. Society gives us all sorts of benefits, but also it hurts us. To become civilized, we pay a huge price. We sacrifice a very large part of who we are, and that sacrifice really is very painful. We repress our desires, we cannot indulge them, and so we are discontent. That's the core of the title, Civilization and its Discontents. It's us who are always discontent. For most social theorists who are not Freudians, the question is, how can we construct a society that allows us all to be happy? Freud says, no matter what you do with society, we will always be unhappy because the simple fact of being in society already prevents us from reaching happiness by forcing us to repress our unconscious desires. You can see that according to Freud, the mind is not just a big machine churning out ideas. It's very carefully organized, into a series of compartments. And there is one more we have to talk about. One more we have to talk about. So the you of consciousness is also called the ego, but really that's just the I. So you've often heard about the ego when people talk about the ego, probably sometimes in an accusatory sense of you're an egotistical maniac, right? Some people might say that. But that just means you're thinking about yourself. So the ego is just the I of consciousness. But there is one more thing also called the superego. Think back to the kids. Okay. Think back to the kids who we're always saying no, no, no to. But at a certain point, as they grow up, you don't have to say no so much anymore. They have learned the lessons you have been trying to teach them. They have become, in a sense, self-policing. They've learned to say no to themselves. And that's because they have internalized the voice of authority saying no. You don't have to say it anymore because you are now inside their head saying no for them, to them. They hear an authority voice saying no, but it's coming from inside. They have sectioned off another part of their mind that is now fully occupied by what once was an external voice, except that now it's become an internal voice. This is the superego. It's above the ego, as in super sits above the ego. It's like a policeman looking down on you saying no. Now, this is important. When you say no to yourself, it's you saying no, right? But also, it's not you. It's part of you. It's a part of you, but it's a part of you that has been colonized or taken over by an outside authority voice. And I'm going to show a slightly more complex diagram. Oops, sorry. Okay. And so you can see that same idea over here of these different diagrams, right, of the conscious. So there's the pre-conscious and the conscious, and then the unconscious, which is this system that's down over here. So that same two-part division over here. There's the pre-conscious that's probably over there. But then there's also this other thing here, this three-part division over here, which is the superego, right? And the superego is that part that's saying to you, no, don't do those things. Don't do those things that you want to do. Part of it stretches up into the ego, but part of it also stretches down into the unconscious over there. And it's with this that we arrive at this kind of three-part structure that Freud maps out. So now, the superego, on the one hand, it's a good thing, right? It's responsible for your good behavior in society and that you are here today, more or less behaving yourselves. But it can also cause all sorts of problems, primary amongst which is guilt. I feel so guilty. I lied to my parents. I told them I was going to study with a friend, but really I went clubbing and had a wild night out on the town. On the one hand, your parents will be upset, it's true. But worse than your parents being upset with you is the fact that you are upset with yourself. That corrosion of your soul, the way the thought process comes back to you and it eats you up inside, is your superego biting into your ego. It's your idea of your parents. And often, in a sense, this is true, not so, that the idea is much worse than the reality. You often think that your parents will react much worse than they actually do. Guilt leads to severe psychological problems, to paralysis, depression, distress. So this guilt is the byproduct, in a sense, of the superego. So now we have this model of the mind as sectioned off, that's true, but also in conflict, always, with itself. Now, so far, I've given you examples drawn from everyday life of the repressed not going away, of the things that we all do. But what Freud is famous for is treating disturbed people, neurotics. And in relation to mentally disturbed people, Freud discovers that many illnesses are caused by the phrase I've just used here, which is the return of the repressed. Let me give you an example. Say you hate potatoes. Makes no sense. Everyone loves potatoes. And it gets worse and worse, and you become ill, and you gag, and you throw up at the thought of them, and you're obsessed. Every time you go out for a meal, you think, what if there are potatoes in there? And eventually it becomes so bad that you're scared to leave the house, and it really ruins your life. So you go to a psychoanalyst and you talk about it, and slowly, slowly you discover a memory. Another child at school, someone who was a bully, who persecuted you, who really made you suffer. And this guy was always eating chips. And every time he approached you, you could smell those chips and you knew what was coming. But after a time it passed and you grew up, you lost your awareness of the whole nasty, horrible event. And you thought that you forgot about the events. But in reality, you repressed them because they were too painful for you to bear and because you hated to think of yourself as a coward and a victim. And then years later, you suddenly find that you cannot bear potatoes or chips, and the fear takes over your life, and you have no idea why. This is the return of the repressed. Ideas sit in that dark suitcase inside you and haunt you, and you're aware of the haunting, and you're aware of the effect, but you have no idea where it comes from because it comes from a part of you of which you are unconscious. So Freud develops a therapy about bringing things to consciousness. And he believes that you can unlock these problems. He believes that you can unlock these problems that haunt you. And the theory is that if you can bring those repressed thoughts out of that dark suitcase and think them through, you will hopefully get better. Once you relive them, think about them, face them, instead of repressing them, you draw that ferocious energy out of them and they stop haunting you to the same degree. Make the unconscious conscious and its dark power fades away. That's one of the major themes of Freud's theory. But now, let me talk about the unconscious just a little bit more, which is where this is all happening. So the unconscious, the point I've been making, and I need to stress again, the unconscious is not just conscious but right? That's pre-conscious. The part of the conscious that's not, the part of the conscious that's like the conscious but is not conscious is the pre-conscious. The unconscious has a very different mode of operation. Now, one of the interesting things, the system of consciousness is characterized largely by reason. It's where reasoning and logic happen. It's our way of thinking, right? So if I say, why are you late? Well, there was a traffic jam. Why are you wearing a jacket? I was cold. The unconscious, however, operates an entirely different system. There is no reason, there is no logic. Why are you late? The answer could be because the trees are green. Right? There's no time, there are no opposites in the unconscious. A is bigger than B could also mean that B is bigger than A. Right? So the whole system of logic and rationality just doesn't apply in the unconscious. And this is really what makes the unconscious into this whole other dimension of things. Now, so how does it work? Let me show you another diagram. This is my diagram over here. So let me show you something. Primary process, unconscious, works primarily by associations. So say we start off with, excuse me. Say we start off with the word chair, or the object chair, right? So we can say, well, what's the association with that? Well, you could go chair to table, right? And that's because they're often chairs and tables go together, right? But then the next association from table could be, say, stable, right? Because they sound the same. So we go table to stable, and then after that, you can have, as often many words are, they mean two different things, right? They've got ambiguous meanings. So stable can mean strong on the one hand, but stable could also be a place where you have a horse. But then a horse is the thing that you use to move around, right? So old times they used horses, now we use cars, and from the car you could maybe get to the shops, right? You could also go the other way, right? So from table, tables have legs, and from a leg you get to say, a leg can be broken, but then the opposite of broken would be perfect. Right. This could be a typical chain of primary process associations. Right. Oh, I didn't use that word, by the way. Right. So this way in which this particular way of working for the unconscious is called primary process. The logical thoughts and procedures by which we think in consciousness is called secondary process, right? So if you're thinking along and your thoughts are making sense, you're working within secondary process. That's just the term. Primary process, though, is this idea here of jumping around in associations. Now, the strange thing about this when you think about this is, so you can see the associations, right, as I'm tracing this one out. But the weird thing is, it's not one association. The association, the linkage between the terms is different. It doesn't stay the same. So from chair to table, it's just because chairs and tables often go together, right? But from table to stable, it's because of the sound of the word. From table to leg, well, and again, it's not even as though the relation of table to leg is different even from table to chair, because table and chair are two different things, but a table now has a leg. But then from a leg, completely different sense of association, which is, well, legs, broken leg, right? You can have a broken leg. And then from broken, you get the opposite, which is perfect. So you can see they're all related to each other, but their relationship doesn't work in the same way. That relationship is different at each point. And it's this kind of jumping process from moving from one to the other with no real logic tying it all together. That's what's called primary process. Now, here's another one of the funny things. In your unconscious, each one of these terms is equivalent, right? So each one of these terms can be equivalent to any one of the other terms, provided this is a chain that's happening in your head. Now, by the way, I just invented this by myself, right, many years ago. Everybody will have a completely different series of chains of associations. Now, the fact that, so first of all, it gives you a weird effect, right? As you say, beyond logic in any sense. But then also, because the other point about each of these being equivalent in some senses gives you some really strange results. Say you have something in your unconscious that your unconscious really wants to express, that it's really obsessed by. Let's go back to that guy who tortured you at school. And you really hate him, and you really want to break his neck, let's just say, right? Your unconscious can represent that breaking his neck by any one of these ideas along the chain. Maybe you keep thinking of a chair, right? It's possible. So you keep, the way it shows up in your consciousness is you keep thinking of a chair. Maybe you can think of a perfect round circle, because the opposite of broken is perfect over there. Any or all of these could represent that fundamental wish of breaking that guy's neck. And in fact, this example, as I first gave it to you, is a little unrealistic. It's unlikely that you would hate potatoes because that's too direct, right? That's too logical over there. You might have a terrible obsession with vinegar, say, or something further along the chain of associations like crinkly packets. That's much more likely because these things they kind of go off in strange directions. They don't follow the logical chain of associations. Now, how does this come out? It comes out in behavior, as we saw with our examples above. In fact, many neurotic symptoms are the acting out of these wishes. In our example above of the guy who tortured you, you're always breaking chairs, say, or you're terrified by, perhaps, horses. By the way, see what I mean by repressed wishes being incompatible with society and civilization. Your innermost wish is to be violent for reasons you don't even remember. Civilization can't deal with that. But there are other ways in which these wishes come out. And one of them is dreams. This is one of Freud's really famous hypotheses. When you are asleep, when all your defenses and the distractions of reality are down, that's when your unconscious roams free. Those strange images that pop up in your dreams, that's the chain of associations rolling along. But talking about those wishes coming out, remember most of the things that are in your unconscious are only there because they're too unacceptable, repulsive even, to be accepted by the consciousness. And that means that when the unconscious wants to express itself, consciousness will not allow those wishes to appear in the form that it finds repulsive. So the unconscious finds a way to get around that conscious prohibition, and it does this through a system of disguise. It's like sneaking into a party from which you've been forbidden. You get past the guards by disguising yourself. In this sense, the guards function in the mind. They function as a system of censorship. So the only conditions under which the unconscious passes into conscious, let me say that again, the only conditions under which the unconscious passes into consciousness is through a disguise. And this chain of associations provides the means of disguise, as I was just saying. Break his neck too violent for yourself? Think of a chair. Now, this keeps all the parts almost happy. To the unconscious, as I was saying, each one of these things is the same. Each one of them is equivalent. Neck and chair have the same value in the unconscious, in the psyche. But to consciousness, neck is impossible, right? You can't say break somebody's neck, but a chair is okay. So it comes through as a chair. Break the chair is much more acceptable than break somebody's neck, but in the unconscious, they're the same. Their functioning is the same because of this chain of equivalent associations. So the dream that you remember, now just coming back to the dreams, the dream that you remember, in other words, the dream that has become conscious, that's the point about the dream, right? When you remember it, it's become conscious, is what remains of a wish or a desire or a memory once it has passed through disguise. It's like going to a costume ball, a dress-up disguise party, where all you see are the strange costumes and masks. That's the dream. You're looking at the strange costumes and masks. This is one of the reasons dreams are so weird. It's the disguise pushing things around so that your consciousness doesn't recognize them. By the way, people love to record their dreams, not so, to tell others about them. But all they're doing is looking at the surface disguise. The true content is lurking below the surface, evading your prying eyes. It's like trying to catch a thief and all you grab is their jacket. Your recollection of your dreams is mostly a collection of jackets that you have pulled off their backs. The thieves always escape. But the guards at the door aren't perfect. The disguise is often not perfect. One of the things the unconscious likes to do with these elements is to blend things together, often in images. It was the shop assistant I saw in the store yesterday. But it's weird, she looked like my sister in the dream. And wait, even more, she looked kind of like my mother. It's all kind of condensed together, not so? And often in that process of condensation, you can find the truth of what your unconscious is getting at. Who exactly? It looked most like the shop assistant, but really, it was my mother that I was dreaming of. So now, let me move on to content just for a little bit. You may notice that so far, I've been talking about a map of the mind and also about the mechanisms of how it works, how it all fits together. But I haven't said much about the content, the subject matter of what goes on in the unconscious. But in fact, Freud gets into a lot of detail about content. Not just that desires in general get repressed, it's that specific desires get repressed or come to take on more importance. And here we're talking primarily about sex. When Freud analyzes his patients, there is one topic above all others that he finds there, and that's sex. In relation to this, let me tell you another little story that comes to us from ancient Greece. Oedipus, a man from the Greek city of Corinth, goes traveling. He gets into a fight at a crossroads, he kills someone. Later he arrives in the city of Thebes, which is ruled over by a queen. There he performs a heroic deed that the people of the city much appreciate. He's proclaimed king in gratitude. He marries the queen of the city and has 2 daughters by her. Several years later, through a strange sequence of events, he discovers that he had in fact been born in the city of Thebes, where he's now living. In fact, he was the son of the king, but had been given away for adoption at an early age to the town of Corinth, which is where he thought he was from and where he had grown up. Now, you may think this is something of a happy fairy tale. Not so. He's born the son of the king, and now through a series of accidents of fate, he returns to the place of his birth. Although he didn't know it was the place of his birth, to take his place on the throne. But no, that's not how it turns out. The story takes a dreadful turn. It further emerges that the man he had killed at the crossroads was his own father, and that the woman he has married, the queen, and by whom he has had children, is his own mother. This is the myth of Oedipus, and it's a famous play by Sophocles from ancient Greece. Okay, Sophocles is the playwright from around 430 BC, and the play is called Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King. Now, Freud analyzes this, and he says it's not just a great play and a myth, but it's a great play because it tells the truth of our own secret desires. Up to now, I've been speaking about the unconscious as being the place where our repressed memories and desires end up. For Freud, the most important repressed desire in the unconscious is the one where boys wish to murder their fathers and marry their mothers. And for girls, they wish to murder their mothers and marry their fathers. This is probably the most controversial point of Freud's work. It's called the Oedipus complex, and you should know about it because it figures largely in popular culture and cultural history. Oedipus complex is one of those terms that's often thrown around. Now, whether you believe the specific details of it or not, of wanting to murder and then marry, the crucial point concerns the notion of sex being at the core of our unconscious, and it is one of the key ideas of psychoanalysis. And before you scoff too loudly, I say this as an aside, ask yourself if your boyfriend or girlfriend doesn't have lots in common with one of your parents. And look around and see how many people have partners that look like their parent of the opposite sex. And if you think about it, it makes sense. When you're young, who are you closest to? Who touches your body? Who caresses you, holds you? Who gives you the most love? To the infant, these are intensely pleasurable, yet have to be renounced as you get older. But those desires, as we saw, don't ever go away. They get pushed into the unconscious, where they stay as desires, seeking satisfaction. Now again, whether you believe in Oedipus or not, the idea of sex in the unconscious is central. Freud gives an example of a woman several times a day running into a room. Let me start that again. So the idea of sex in the unconscious is central. Freud gives us an example of a woman who several times a day runs into a room, upsets a glass of water onto the tablecloth, and calls for the maid. It's totally bizarre, right? Did you follow that? So a woman, the mistress of the house, several times a day runs into a room, throws over a glass of water, and then calls the maid. It's totally bizarre. No one knows what it's about. But again, it's ruining everybody's life. On analysis, and she goes and she speaks to Freud, it turns out, the following story turns out, she marries a man much older than her who could not consummate the marriage. The woman is very embarrassed and hopes the maid will not notice in the morning, and so she throws red ink on the sheets. Years later, she has forgotten the episode, but has developed a strange symptom. See how many strands to come together in the story. Sex and the return of the repressed. Her wish is to prove to the maid that her husband is not impotent, and she repeats the action to show the maid the proof. But see the primary process in action here, right? Through the chain of associations, she repeats the action, she calls in a maid, the maid, except now it's not the maid who was initially there, it's any maid. Blood or red ink that you had seen in the first step, blood or red ink no longer in process, something liquid water will do to replace blood or red ink. You can see the chain of associations moving along over here. And see the disguise. To the maid, indeed to anyone, it's all meaningless. It only means something in the unconscious of the person who's doing it. So to end, to return to civilization and its discontents, we spoke earlier about our inner wishes, not just violence, but more importantly, sex, which has to be controlled by society. Now, we saw that civilization forces us to repress our instincts, our desires, and so we are unhappy. But we have also seen that repression does not work 100%, because the repressed always returns, and when it returns, when repression is undone, it threatens to tear society apart. No one is ever happy in this story. As humans, we are unsatisfied because suppressed. But civilization and society is always under attack by failed repression. Society is always in a fragile state, just about to collapse. It's all a very unstable balance. Now, the other thing is that this is all highly controversial, right? I'm presenting it to you as these are Freud's theories, but every aspect of Freud's theories are highly controversial. Many people don't like the idea of the unconscious, although I think, in fact, that most ordinary people, certainly in the Western world, have come to accept this idea. I don't hear many people objecting to the idea of the unconscious. In fact, people seem to embrace the idea and really seem to have no problem holding on to it. But what about the question of sex? Now, if you mention Freud in popular culture, most people will think of the sex angle. And without a doubt, this is one of his major revolutions. It is highly controversial, but simultaneously most influential. And however much you may knock him and criticize him, I'm afraid he has already won. How so? This idea of sex at the core of the unconscious also means that sex is at the core of who we are. But if this was a revolutionary idea in 1900 in Vienna, hasn't it become true now? We, in our modern times, don't stop talking about sex. It's with us all the time. It's prevalent in our popular culture, from advertising to the way we dress. Think about the way we dress. Think about the way people used to dress 100 years ago. So it's with us, as I say, from advertising to the way we dress, to music videos. I quote here any video by Nicki Minaj just to make my point. This all, in some ways, goes back to Freud. I'm not saying that he caused it, but he opened the subject and began thinking about it very early. This idea of humans as inherently sexual, that sex is at our center, is also an idea that is accepted by many people, I think, especially in Western society. Before Freud, sex was never at the center of the universe. Think of how people dressed, as I say over here. Think of how they behaved. Sex was something never spoken about, never really acknowledged. This is one of Freud's major revolutions. He really changed the way we think about ourselves. But personally, I think the greatest revolution is not sex, but the notion of the unconscious. The idea that a part of us is not only beyond our control, but beyond our knowing. That we are not in control of ourselves, that we are strangers to ourselves, that we are not one subject, but two. These ideas are profoundly destabilizing. This goes against everything that we think we are. Our whole civilization is built on it, that ultimately we are sovereign individuals in control of ourselves, doing what we want, right? That's the underpinning of what civilization is about. Not so, says Freud. In this respect, Freud is often paired with Darwin. Darwin shocked everyone by overturning the idea that we are, as humans, a special creation of God. People were amazed at the idea that we are just like animals, related to monkeys and chimpanzees. Freud takes this debunking of our elevated idea of ourselves even further. We are not even in control of ourselves. We are not even masters in our own houses. And his idea of civilization and its discontents is still something that we struggle with every day. Ultimately, says Freud, the part of us that most strongly wants to do what it wants to do cannot because of civilization. And the part of us that actually can do what it wants is really making do with second best. Thank you.